The air felt thick with tension the moment he entered. It was an ordinary afternoon in the bustling diner, until Dr. Miles Jameson, a respected physician, stepped through the door. As he glanced around, looking for a place to sit, a strange stillness settled over the room. Miles was used to getting stares from time to time, but today felt different. He brushed it off and signaled for a table, ready to enjoy his rare lunch break. Before he could take a step further, a waitress with a sharp gaze intercepted him, her expression cool and uninviting. "I'm sorry, sir," she began, her voice laced with an unspoken judgment that clung to the words like static. "We're full." Miles glanced around, his brow furrowing as he saw more than one empty table. "I can see a few spots open," he replied politely, but his eyes searched hers, hoping for a trace of warmth or understanding. Instead, her gaze hardened. "Those tables are reserved," she snapped, folding her arms and standing firm, as if daring him to challenge her word. There was a finality in her tone, an unyielding resolve that said she'd be willing to make a scene if he pushed any further. Miles took a steadying breath, choosing to keep his composure. He had experienced this before, that wall of assumptions people sometimes built around him, defining him before he even spoke. But today, for some reason, the sting felt sharper. He felt the weight of every patron's eyes on him, whispering judgments they didn't dare voice. With a soft sigh, he turned to leave, deciding to avoid a confrontation. But just as he reached the door, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. "Dr. Jameson, it's so good to see you." A young nurse from the hospital had entered the diner, and her face lit up as she spotted him. The waitress's face paled. Her expression flickered with recognition as the pieces began to fall into place, and in that single moment, her confidence faltered. Realization washed over her as she comprehended the mistake she'd made, and she watched in growing horror as the murmurs in the diner grew louder, patrons whispering to each other, piecing together the scene that had just unfolded. Miles didn't need to say a word. The nurse's enthusiastic greeting had spoken volumes, leaving the waitress to confront the weight of her actions, feeling the judgment from all those around her. And as Dr. Jameson turned to meet her gaze one last time, she saw in his eyes a mirror of her own shame. In just those few minutes, she went from feeling untouchable to completely unmasked, left to grapple with a realization that she couldn't hide from, even as he quietly walked away. Her name was Linda Marshall, a woman in her late 30s who had lived her whole life in this small town. She was known for her disciplined, no-nonsense attitude, a trait she took immense pride in. Linda had worked at the diner for over a decade, priding herself on efficiency and a knack for maintaining order. She liked things predictable, manageable, and above all, familiar. Her job, while not glamorous, gave her a sense of control over a world that often felt chaotic. Linda was raised by parents who instilled in her a rigid set of values about hard work, self-sufficiency, and knowing one's place. Her father, a retired military officer, was strict and demanding, running their household with military precision. He was not a man of many words, but his disdain for anything outside his worldview was clear. He had always been wary of outsiders and preached that they often brought trouble. Linda grew up absorbing this perspective, learning that strangers were to be approached with caution and that change was something to be managed, not embraced. In high school, Linda kept to herself, never quite fitting in with the cliques around her. She'd watch others laughing, sharing secrets, and making memories, while she sat on the sidelines, feeling a mix of resentment and longing. To shield herself from the sting of exclusion, she doubled down on her commitment to rules and routines, finding a strange comfort in the predictability they offered. She believed that if she stayed on her path, if she followed the rules to a T, she'd eventually be rewarded for her discipline and loyalty. The world felt safer that way. Her job at the diner became her sanctuary. Here, she could enforce the small rules that made her feel in control. Linda was known for her insistence on adherence to her unwritten house rules. If you wanted to be served, you should look a certain way, speak a certain way, and above all, respect her authority. Over the years, her worldview hardened. To her, every customer was a test, each interaction a small ritual to assert her control. Yet there was a flaw in Linda's perspective that she couldn't see. Her beliefs led her to make snap judgments about people based solely on appearances. She developed the habit of categorizing others almost instinctively, relying on her upbringing and biases to determine who deserved her respect and who did not. Linda never questioned the fairness of her methods because they'd always worked for her. The rules she created in her mind became the foundation of her authority and self-worth. In her world, people were either respectable or troublemakers. She saw the signs everywhere: clothing, demeanor, even the confidence or hesitation in someone's step. To her, these were indicators of a person's character, a kind of code she believed only she was capable of deciphering. Her judgments weren't based on hate, she'd tell herself. They were about safety, order, and keeping things decent. Deep down, Linda feared that loosening her grip would somehow unravel everything she had worked for, leaving her vulnerable to the unknown and the unpredictable. But her need for control had a cost. Though Linda was respected at the diner for her hard work, she lacked genuine friendships, and her life outside of work was lonely. She was estranged from her siblings, who'd moved away and built lives very different from hers. She hadn't spoken to her father in years. He disapproved of her life choices, believing she should have aimed higher, and though Linda would never admit it, she often questioned her worth, wondering if there was more to life than keeping people in line. So, when Dr. Jameson entered the diner, Linda saw him not as a potential customer but as an outsider, a disruption to her carefully crafted world. To her, he fit a category she recognized: someone who didn't belong. In that moment, she wasn't seeing the man in front of her, a respected doctor who had saved countless lives. She'd only saw an intruder who didn't fit her narrow standards, someone who, by her definition, wasn't worthy of the space he occupied. Her reaction to him was instant, automatic, and as she justified to herself, just her way of keeping things in order. But beneath that justification, Linda was blind to the deep-seated prejudices fueling her behavior. She didn't realize that her rigidity, her need for control, and her narrow worldview were hurting not just others, but herself. She'd spent so long clinging to her beliefs that she had no room for growth, no ability to recognize the humanity in those who didn't fit her mold. As she watched Dr. Jameson turn to leave, she felt a fleeting pang of something, perhaps a warning, a tiny voice reminding her that she'd crossed a line. But she silenced it, as she'd always did, leaning on the familiar comfort of the rules she'd constructed. Yet deep inside, Linda was on the edge of an internal battle she didn't even know she was about to face, a battle that would challenge everything she thought she knew about people, about control, and, ultimately, about herself. Linda was a creature of habit, and her shifts at the diner followed a strict rhythm she had honed over the years. She liked to start her day early, arriving at the diner before most of the town was even awake. The empty, quiet space felt like her domain, and she moved with a sense of authority, preparing the tables, checking the menus, and setting everything in its rightful place. Every detail mattered to her. Every routine task was a piece of her order, a slice of the control she valued so highly. Today, however, there was an unusual tension in the air. A few more out-of-towners were around than usual, passing through the small town for a regional medical conference being held nearby. Linda didn't care for visitors. They disrupted her routines, brought with them different customs, and often made her feel as if she was an afterthought in their whirlwind of meetings and quick meals. She found herself irritated by their presence, though she couldn't quite put a finger on why. As the morning slipped into afternoon, Linda's restlessness grew. She scanned the dining area, adjusting the salt and pepper shakers on each table, making sure napkins were folded just so. She liked a quiet shift, with predictable regulars who respected her rules and knew their place. Today, however, felt different. There was an unease she couldn't shake, and she found herself becoming more rigid, more determined to keep things under her control. Then she noticed a man at the entrance, stepping through the door with a calm, self-assured demeanor. He was dressed in a tailored suit, neatly pressed and sharply cut, with an air of quiet confidence that immediately put Linda on edge. He didn't look like the regular patrons who shuffled in and out of the diner. To Linda, he didn't even look like he belonged in this town. Something about his presence unsettled her, challenging the rigid boundaries of her world. Dr. Miles Jameson was a well-known figure in his field, but to Linda, he was just another outsider who didn't fit into her narrow expectations. He glanced around, taking in the rustic charm of the diner, unaware of the scrutiny Linda was giving him. She felt her pulse quicken, her muscles tensing as she observed him. To her, he looked out of place, like he didn't belong in her diner. A judgment began to form in her mind, a conviction that he was there to disrupt her carefully maintained order. As Dr. Jameson took a step toward an empty booth near the window, Linda intercepted him. She stood directly in his path, her posture rigid, her eyes hard. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone laced with a subtle hostility that betrayed her bias. "Yes, I'd like a table, please," Dr. Jameson replied, maintaining a polite smile, oblivious to the tension simmering within her. Linda narrowed her eyes, the tension in her jaw hardening. She glanced around the diner, her mind racing with judgments and assumptions. Her gaze drifted back to Dr. Jameson, and an unspoken, biased narrative began to take shape in her mind. "He's probably someone who thinks he's better than the rest of us. Here to throw his weight around," she thought, her prejudices clouding her perception. Without a second thought, she said, "We're full up right now." Dr. Jameson looked around, clearly noting the empty tables. "I see several open seats. I don't mind waiting if one is reserved." Linda felt her jaw tighten. The way he questioned her, even politely, only intensified her resolve to maintain control. She had learned to read people quickly, or at least she believed she could. To her, Dr. Jameson was just another outsider who probably didn't respect the values of her town, someone who saw the diner as a quick stop without understanding the place it held in the community. She straightened her shoulders, crossing her arms as she shot him a frosty smile. "I'm sorry, sir, but those tables are reserved." Her words were final, her tone making it clear she wasn't open to negotiation. In her mind, she was simply enforcing her rules, maintaining the order she cherished. Dr. Jameson hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. For a brief moment, his calm demeanor faltered as he considered her response. He'd encountered prejudice before. It was an unfortunate reality he had come to expect, but this time it struck him deeply. This wasn't just a random passerby with a disapproving glance or an unpleasant comment under their breath. This was direct, overt, and something about it felt particularly unjust. He sensed that challenging her would only escalate things further, so he took a deep breath, choosing to let the moment pass. "Very well," he said, his voice measured, though there was a hint of disappointment in his tone. Linda watched him, feeling a sense of triumph in having upheld her rules. She didn't think twice about the impact of her actions, nor did she consider the underlying motivations for her behavior. In her mind, she had simply prevented a potential disruption, someone she had deemed unfit for her sacred space. She allowed herself a slight smile, content that order had been preserved. But as Dr. Jameson turned to leave, a familiar face entered the diner, a young woman named Sarah, a nurse at the local hospital who knew Dr. Jameson well. Sarah's face lit up the moment she saw him, and she called out, "Dr. Jameson, I didn't know you'd be in town." Her voice was bright and full of genuine warmth, contrasting sharply with Linda's icy reception. Linda's smile faltered. She watched, frozen, as the realization began to dawn on her. "Doctor?" The word echoed in her mind, unraveling the assumptions she'd made. As Sarah rushed over, chatting excitedly with Dr. Jameson and speaking of him with obvious respect, Linda felt her confidence waver. It was like the ground beneath her had suddenly shifted, leaving her standing on unsteady footing. A murmur rippled through the diner as patrons picked up on the exchange, sensing that something unusual had just transpired. Whispers began to circulate, people glancing at Linda, their expressions ranging from confusion to subtle disapproval. It didn't take long for Linda to realize that her rules were now being questioned, that her actions were not as invisible as she had thought. Dr. Jameson exchanged a few friendly words with Sarah, his initial disappointment softening as he focused on their conversation. He noticed the lingering glances from other diners and the shift in Linda's demeanor, but he remained poised, choosing to rise above the incident. As he prepared to leave, he gave Linda a brief, meaningful look, one that was neither confrontational nor bitter, but filled with a quiet, unspoken question, a question that forced her to confront the unfairness of her actions. For Linda, this was more than a momentary lapse. The realization hit her with a force she hadn't anticipated, leaving her face flushed with embarrassment and her mind racing with questions she couldn't immediately answer. Her rigid worldview had been challenged in an instant, the assumptions she'd clung to now exposed for what they were. The satisfaction she had felt in enforcing her rules turned to something heavy, something that settled in her chest and refused to budge. As Dr. Jameson and Sarah continued their conversation, Linda found herself rooted to the spot, struggling to process the weight of her actions. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had not only disrespected a customer, but had revealed a part of herself that she wasn't proud of. The whispers around her grew louder, each one a reminder of her misjudgment, her snap decision based on prejudice rather than understanding. Linda's face flushed as the enormity of her actions sank in. She had misjudged him, and now the entire diner bore witness to the unfairness of her actions. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, and for the first time, she found herself questioning the values she had held onto for so long, the ones that had defined her sense of control and security. As she watched Dr. Jameson leave, the urge to turn away, to hide from the gazes of those around her, grew overwhelming. In that moment, Linda knew that she couldn't just brush off what had happened. She could feel the conflict building inside her, a conflict that threatened to unravel the rigid worldview she had clung to for so long. Dr. Miles Jameson had worked his entire life to get where he was. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, he was raised by parents who instilled in him a relentless work ethic, resilience, and compassion for others. His father was a high school teacher, and his mother worked two jobs as a nurse and caregiver. Both tirelessly supported him and his three siblings, making countless sacrifices to give them a better future. From a young age, Miles had admired his mother's strength, watching her come home late at night, exhausted yet smiling, filled with stories of how she had helped people in need. It was her example that inspired him to pursue medicine, to become someone who could offer care and support to those who needed it most. Miles was a dedicated student, pouring his energy into his studies and part-time jobs to help his family and save for college. After years of hard work, scholarships, and sheer determination, he earned his place in medical school, eventually specializing in cardiology. He saw his calling not just as a job, but as a responsibility, a way to honor the sacrifices his family had made for him and to give back to his community. Today, he was known as a compassionate and skilled physician, admired by his colleagues and beloved by his patients. But despite his professional success, Miles knew he had a larger responsibility: to break down the biases and stereotypes that often followed people who looked like him. He was no stranger to the subtle looks of doubt or the questioning tones in others' voices, but he had always chosen to rise above it. Miles believed deeply in the power of kindness and understanding to change hearts and minds, and he approached each day with a quiet determination to prove that everyone deserved respect and compassion, regardless of appearance. On this particular day, Dr. Jameson had a rare break from the conference he was attending. It was a chance to unwind, and he decided to take a walk around town, appreciating the quiet charm of the small streets and old-fashioned buildings. He felt relaxed, enjoying the rare freedom from his packed schedule. As he walked, he saw a quaint little diner with a neon sign buzzing in the window. It seemed inviting, and he thought it would be nice to sit down for a simple meal and gather his thoughts. When he entered the diner, he felt the quiet shift in atmosphere, but he didn't think much of it. He had encountered similar reactions before, people glancing his way with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their expressions hinting at the subtle prejudices that lingered just below the surface. Over time, he had learned to brush these moments off, to focus on the things that mattered, and to continue treating others with respect and kindness. Today was no different. He was just a man looking to enjoy his meal. As he approached the counter, he was intercepted by Linda, the waitress. Her expression was distant, her eyes sizing him up with a thinly veiled disdain. Miles felt a pang of disappointment, sensing the unspoken judgment in her gaze. He was a guest in her town, a man of accomplishment and respect, yet here he was, standing before someone who saw him as less than that, as if he were somehow unworthy of the simple kindness of a meal. Despite his own rising discomfort, Miles greeted her with a smile and a polite request for a table, doing his best to push past the feeling of unfairness that gnawed at him. But Linda's response was cold, dismissive. Her tone left no room for discussion, shutting him down before he could say another word. "We're full," she said, her voice clipped and final. Confusion flashed across his face. He glanced around, noting the empty tables scattered throughout the room. He could have pointed it out, could have challenged her claim, but he felt his throat tighten, a familiar frustration rising within him. Years of experience had taught him that moments like these were often best handled with grace rather than confrontation. Still, it hurt, not because he needed validation, but because he had hoped, just for once, to be seen for who he truly was. Taking a steadying breath, Miles kept his composure. He didn't want to make a scene, especially not in a town where he was a stranger. He nodded, offering her a polite smile, even though his heart felt heavy with the sting of her judgment. He was a man who had dedicated his life to helping others, to saving lives. Yet here he was, reduced to a caricature, seen through a lens that obscured his true self. As he turned to leave, his mind swirled with a mixture of frustration, disappointment, and sadness. He had faced prejudice before, but it never ceased to surprise him, each time feeling like a new wound. Despite all he had achieved, all the lives he had touched, moments like these reminded him that he was still, in some eyes, just another stranger to be judged, just another person unworthy of basic respect. But then, just as he was about to step out the door, he heard a voice calling his name, a voice filled with warmth and respect. "Dr. Jameson, I didn't know you were in town." It was Sarah, a nurse he had worked with during a recent medical outreach program. Her face lit up as she approached, her respect for him evident in her wide smile and excited tone. In that moment, Miles felt a surge of relief and gratitude. He turned to greet her, his smile genuine, the warmth in her voice soothing the sting of Linda's earlier rejection. For a few moments, he forgot the pain of the previous encounter, immersing himself in Sarah's friendly greeting and their shared stories of work and mutual patience. But as they spoke, he noticed Linda watching from behind the counter, her face shifting from cold disinterest to uneasy recognition. Miles didn't need to say anything. Sarah's enthusiasm spoke volumes, making it clear to everyone nearby that he was someone of importance, someone worthy of respect. The patrons around them started to murmur, piecing together what had just happened, their gazes now lingering on Linda with quiet disapproval. Despite the validation, Miles felt no satisfaction in Linda's discomfort. His heart ached for a world where he could simply be seen as a man, not judged by the color of his skin or the assumptions others projected onto him. As Sarah continued to sing his praises, he made a silent vow to keep showing up in places where he was overlooked, to keep pushing for understanding, even in the face of ignorance and prejudice. As the conversation with Sarah wrapped up, Miles looked back at Linda one last time, meeting her gaze with a calm yet penetrating look. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet resolve, a silent question that lingered between them. Why? Why is it so hard to see beyond the surface, to treat others with basic decency? He didn't need to say it out loud. The weight of his gaze conveyed everything. The emotional weight of the incident settled on him as he walked out of the diner, his heart heavy but his spirit unbroken. Miles knew that prejudice wasn't something he could control, but he had control over his own actions, over the dignity he chose to carry. Though the encounter had left him shaken, it had also strengthened his resolve. He would continue to live his life with the integrity his parents had instilled in him, to embody the compassion he hoped others might one day offer freely. Outside he paused, taking in the quiet of the small town street, a reminder that he was so much more than the narrow judgment of one person. And as he walked away, he reminded himself that he would continue to lead by example, to challenge the boundaries set by others, to teach not through anger, but through resilience, patience, and kindness. As Dr. Jameson exchanged words with Sarah, and Linda watched in growing discomfort, the atmosphere in the diner grew tense and thick with unspoken emotions. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone made the wrong assumptions about you? Comment below where you're watching from and share your story. And if this resonates with you, hit subscribe for more stories that uncover powerful moments of justice and growth. Linda's discomfort lingered long after Dr. Jameson left the diner. As the day continued, she felt the stares of the patrons like needles on her skin, the whispered exchanges and sideways glances that made her shift uneasily. She was used to maintaining control, enforcing her rules in her domain, but today that confidence had cracked. She had spent years carefully cultivating her authority at the diner, and in a single moment, she felt that authority slipping. The aftermath began slowly but soon picked up momentum. Word of her interaction with Dr. Jameson spread quickly through the small town. It started with a few patrons mentioning it to friends. their hushed voices filled with disapproval and surprise. By the end of the day, Linda noticed that people were looking at her differently, some with silent judgment and others with open disdain. The regulars she was accustomed to greeting with casual nods and small talk now seemed distant, their expressions hard to interpret but undeniably colder. The following morning, Linda arrived at the diner, her steps feeling heavier than usual. She hoped the incident would fade, that it would be brushed aside like so many small-town rumors. But as she entered, she found the diner unusually quiet. Sarah, the young nurse who had warmly greeted Dr. Jameson, sat at a table near the window, speaking with several other nurses from the hospital. Their conversation stopped as she walked in, and she felt their eyes on her, a tension in the air that was hard to ignore. Linda forced herself to look away, unwilling to acknowledge the knot of unease forming in her stomach. But the tension only grew as the hours ticked by, and her discomfort began turning into resentment. Why should I be the one to feel uncomfortable? She thought defensively, trying to justify her actions to herself. He didn't fit in here. He didn't belong in this place, and I was just doing my job. Yet deep down, she could feel the weight of her own words, the hollowness of her justifications. Her rules, once her source of strength and control, now felt like chains around her, dragging her down with the realization that they had only served to isolate her from others. Her resentment didn't shield her from the rising sense of regret and shame that settled over her like a cloud she couldn't shake. That evening, Linda received an unexpected call from the diner's owner, Mr. Wilkes. He was an older man, known for his friendly demeanor and long-standing reputation in town. But his tone on the phone was uncharacteristically cold and clipped. Linda, I've had several people reach out to me about an incident at the diner yesterday. He began without preamble. A doctor from out of town. A respected man, I hear, who was turned away without reason. Linda felt a wave of dread wash over her. Mr. Wilkes, I can explain, she stammered, trying to regain her composure. I was just trying to keep order, to make sure things ran smoothly. You know how important it is to keep the place under control, especially with all these out-of-towners around. Mr. Wilkes was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice held a hint of disappointment. Linda, I understand your concern, but you didn't act with respect. This town isn't a place for that kind of treatment, and our diner certainly isn't. People have trusted you to treat every customer fairly. I'm getting calls from people who feel that trust has been broken. She struggled to respond, feeling her defenses crumble under his words. Mr. Wilkes informed her that he would be temporarily reducing her hours as a warning, a consequence of her actions that struck harder than she cared to admit. Linda had spent years building her place at the diner, and the thought of losing it, even partially, filled her with dread. This job wasn't just her livelihood. It was her sense of identity, her place in a world that often felt uncertain. But the professional consequences were only the beginning. Over the next few days, Linda's interactions with the townspeople grew increasingly uncomfortable. She'd hear her name whispered as she walked through town, neighbors casting disapproving glances as she passed by. Sarah's story had spread, and it was clear that people were starting to see her in a new, unflattering light. One afternoon, she stopped by the grocery store, hoping to escape the quiet judgment she felt at work. As she picked up a few items, she noticed a mother and daughter in the aisle, their conversation ceasing as she approached. The young girl looked up at her with a furrowed brow, a hint of curiosity mixed with something else in her eyes. Disappointment, maybe even disapproval. Linda turned away, her cheeks burning. She couldn't bear the weight of those young, innocent eyes on her, seeing her not as the diligent waitress she'd always tried to be, but as something else, something she didn't want to acknowledge. That night, Linda sat alone in her small apartment, the silence pressing in on her. She tried to distract herself, flipping through the television channels, but nothing could drown out the gnawing feeling inside. She kept replaying the incident in her mind, the look in Dr. Jameson's eyes as he turned to leave, a quiet question that had echoed in her mind ever since. Why? Why couldn't she have treated him with the same respect she expected from others? Her guilt began to shift into something deeper, a realization of the patterns she clung to for so long, the judgments she had built her life around. The excuses that had once felt so solid, so comforting, now felt hollow and weak, crumbling under the weight of her own actions. Linda found herself grappling with the truth. She had let her biases, her own insecurities, shape her view of others, blinding her to the humanity right in front of her. The final blow came a week later, when Mr. Wilkes called her back into his office. He sat her down, his face somber yet compassionate. "Linda, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I believe it's time for a change. I know this job means a lot to you, but it's clear that things can't continue as they are. This incident has affected not only you, but also the diner's reputation and the trust our customers place in us." Linda's heart sank as he spoke. She could feel her world, her sense of control and stability, slipping away. Mr. Wilkes didn't fire her, but he insisted she take a leave of absence to reflect on her actions and consider how she wanted to approach her role moving forward. It was a blow to her pride, a forced confrontation with the consequences of her own choices. As she left the diner, Linda felt a mix of shame, regret, and a strange, unfamiliar sense of clarity. The walls she had built, the rigid rules she had enforced, were all crumbling around her. The control she had clung to had been an illusion, a shield against the fears and insecurities she hadn't dared to face. In the quiet of her apartment that night, Linda stared at her reflection in the mirror, her face lined with exhaustion, her eyes holding a new depth of understanding. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her actions fully, to acknowledge the pain she had caused, not just to Dr. Jameson, but to herself. She realized that her need for control, her judgments, had left her isolated and bitter, unable to connect with others in a meaningful way. The path to redemption wouldn't be easy, she knew. But as she sat there, wrestling with the discomfort, she felt the first stirrings of a desire to change. The road ahead was uncertain, but Linda understood that the only way forward was to let go of the old rules that had trapped her and to open herself to a new way of seeing the world, a way that embraced empathy, humility, and perhaps forgiveness. Linda's leave from the diner felt like both a punishment and a blessing. The familiar routines that once structured her life were now absent, leaving her with long days to fill and plenty of time to reflect. She spent the first few days in a fog of shame and resentment, still clinging to the idea that her actions had been justified. But as the silence stretched on, she found it harder to ignore the gnawing sense of guilt and the memories of those disappointed faces in the diner. One morning, restless and frustrated, Linda decided to take a walk through town. As she wandered aimlessly, her eyes fell on the local community center, a modest building with a sign advertising volunteer opportunities. Without really thinking, she pushed open the doors and found herself in the warm, bustling space filled with people of all ages. She had never set foot in the community center before, feeling it was not her place. But something about the atmosphere drew her in. A kind-faced older woman approached her with a welcoming smile. "Hello, looking to volunteer?" she asked, her tone gentle and warm. For a moment, Linda hesitated, feeling out of place. But the woman's kindness softened her defenses, and she found herself nodding. Over the next few weeks, Linda began volunteering at the center, helping organize events, serving meals, and assisting with daily tasks. At first, she kept to herself, avoiding conversations and interactions that felt uncomfortable. But as time went on, she found herself connecting with the people around her. The community center drew a diverse crowd, people from all walks of life, backgrounds, and ages. She met single mothers juggling jobs and children, retired veterans, young students, and even a few of her regular customers from the diner. Linda's initial discomfort began to melt away as she listened to their stories, stories of struggle, resilience, and kindness. One afternoon, as she served lunch to a group of seniors, she overheard a conversation that struck a chord. One of the women, a retired teacher, was telling a friend about a young man who had faced discrimination but continued to treat others with respect. Her story was filled with admiration for the man's perseverance and dignity, and it reminded Linda of Dr. Jameson. That evening, Linda sat alone, her mind replaying the incident at the diner and the look in Dr. Jameson's eyes. She remembered the way he had quietly walked away, choosing dignity over confrontation. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her actions, to see how deeply her prejudice had clouded her judgment. She realized that her narrow worldview had prevented her from seeing people as they truly were, from understanding the richness of their experiences. The next day, she approached Mrs. Jensen, the woman who ran the community center, and asked if there were other ways she could help. She wanted to do more than serve meals or stack chairs. She wanted to make a real difference. Mrs. Jensen, sensing the sincerity in Linda's voice, suggested she join the center's outreach program, which helped support individuals transitioning back into the workforce or facing economic hardships. Linda's work with the outreach program was a humbling experience. She met people whose lives were filled with struggles she had never considered, people whose resilience and kindness challenged her old beliefs. She assisted in job training workshops, helped organize food drives, and spent time talking to people whose backgrounds and experiences were vastly different from her own. Each conversation chipped away at her old prejudices, replacing them with empathy and understanding. One evening, after a particularly moving conversation with a young woman who had been unfairly dismissed from her job due to racial discrimination, Linda felt a pang of regret so deep it nearly brought her to tears. She saw in this woman's story a mirror of her own behavior, her own assumptions, and the harm she had caused without realizing it. That night, Linda wrote a letter to Dr. Jameson, explaining what had happened since their encounter, her regret, and her newfound commitment to change. She wasn't sure if she would ever send it, but the act of writing it felt like a necessary step in her journey. Weeks turned into months, and Linda's work at the community center became a central part of her life. She began to notice changes in herself, subtle shifts in the way she saw the world and the people around her. The rigid boundaries she had once clung to faded, replaced by a more open and compassionate perspective. She found herself listening more, asking questions, and learning about experiences that once would have seemed foreign to her. One day, during a break at the community center, she was approached by Sarah, the nurse who had been with Dr. Jameson that day in the diner. Sarah's expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said gently, her tone carrying no judgment, only a quiet surprise. Linda felt a surge of vulnerability. She hadn't expected to run into someone who knew about the incident, let alone someone who had witnessed it firsthand. She took a deep breath, gathering the courage to speak. "Sarah, I owe you and Dr. Jameson an apology," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What I did that day was wrong, and I'm truly sorry. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, trying to understand my own mistakes." Sarah listened intently, her expression softening as Linda spoke. When Linda finished, Sarah gave a small nod. "Thank you for saying that. It takes a lot to admit when we're wrong. I think Dr. Jameson would appreciate knowing that you're working to change." Buoyed by Sarah's response, Linda decided to deliver the letter she had written to Dr. Jameson. She took the time to craft it carefully, expressing her regret not only for how she had treated him, but also for the beliefs she had held for so long. In her letter, she recounted her journey of self-reflection, the changes she had made in her life, and her work at the community center. She asked for his forgiveness, not expecting it, but hoping to convey the sincerity of her transformation. When she finally sent the letter, she felt an unexpected lightness, as if a burden she'd been carrying had finally lifted. The shame and regret that had once haunted her were now tempered by a sense of purpose, a commitment to live differently, to continue the work of understanding others with an open heart. Several weeks later, Linda received a response from Dr. Jameson. His words were gracious and kind, thanking her for her honesty and courage. He expressed hope that her journey would lead her to a place of understanding and compassion. "We all make mistakes," he wrote. "What matters most is that we learn from them and work to become better people." The letter brought tears to Linda's eyes. It was more than forgiveness. It was an affirmation that her efforts to change had been seen and acknowledged. She held his words close, a reminder of the path she had chosen and the work that still lay ahead. Over time, Linda became a fixture at the community center, known not only for her dedication, but also for her empathy and kindness. She forged connections with people she once would have dismissed, learning from each of them and growing with every conversation. She no longer saw her work as a way to maintain order, but as an opportunity to support others, to offer the understanding and respect she had once withheld. Linda's journey was far from over, but she had found a new sense of purpose, a life defined not by rigid rules or narrow beliefs, but by compassion and openness. She returned to the diner eventually, her role there transformed. She treated each customer with genuine respect, taking the time to listen, to connect, and to see beyond her old assumptions. In the end, Linda's redemption was not a single moment, but a series of choices, small acts of kindness and understanding that accumulated over time. She had learned that change was a journey, one that required patience, humility, and a willingness to confront her own flaws. And though the road was difficult, she knew it was the only path worth taking. As she continued her work at the diner and the community center, Linda found peace in the knowledge that she was making amends, one day at a time, growing into the person she had always wanted to be, someone capable of seeing others for who they truly were, and not for the narrow assumptions she had once clung to. Months had passed since Linda first began her journey of self-reflection and change. Her work at the community center had become a constant source of growth, and her perspective on life had transformed in ways she never imagined. Linda had not only confronted her own biases, but had actively worked to dismantle the walls she had built around herself. Her new understanding of compassion, empathy, and respect had reshaped her interactions with everyone she met, especially at the diner where she had resumed her position with a new sense of purpose. One Saturday afternoon, Linda was working her shift when she saw a familiar face walk through the door, Dr. Jameson. He stood tall and composed, his eyes scanning the room until they met hers. Linda's heart skipped a beat, and a wave of mixed emotions flooded her. She felt gratitude, humility, and a quiet determination to show him how much she had changed. This was the moment she had hoped for, a chance to make amends in person. Without hesitation, Linda approached Dr. Jameson with a warm, genuine smile. "Dr. Jameson, it's good to see you again. Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know I've already written to you, but I want to apologize in person for my behavior. I can't take back what happened, but I hope to show you that I've changed." Dr. Jameson studied her for a moment, a soft smile forming on his face. "Thank you, Linda. I can see that you've taken this to heart, and that means a lot. Change isn't easy, but it's clear you've put in the effort." Linda felt a surge of relief and gratitude. She offered him a seat at one of the tables near the window, and as she served him his order, their conversation began to flow naturally. They talked not just about the incident, but about her work at the community center, her new understanding of compassion, and the impact it had on her life. Dr. Jameson listened intently, nodding thoughtfully, and occasionally sharing his own experiences with prejudice and resilience. What began as a simple act of service turned into an hour-long conversation about growth, forgiveness, and the strength it takes to challenge one's own beliefs. As they talked, several patrons in the diner noticed the exchange. Some of them were regulars who had witnessed Linda's transformation over the past few months, and others were new faces drawn into the warmth of the moment. People watched as Linda spoke with humility and sincerity, her openness evident in every word. It was clear that she had grown beyond the rigid person she once was, becoming someone who valued understanding over judgment. Toward the end of their conversation, Dr. Jameson looked around at the other patrons, then back at Linda. "You know, it's rare to see someone truly embrace change the way you have," he said, his voice carrying a tone of respect. "Your journey might inspire others to do the same." Linda nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She knew that her path had been a difficult one, but his validation filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft. "I hope so. If there's anything I've learned, it's that everyone deserves a second chance, a chance to be seen for who they truly are." Just as Dr. Jameson was preparing to leave, Sarah, the nurse who had been there the first day, entered the diner with a group of friends. She spotted Linda and Dr. Jameson talking and approached their table with a smile. "It's wonderful to see you two together," she said, her tone warm and sincere. "Linda, I've seen the changes you've made, and I just want you to know that the community appreciates it. You've become an important part of this place." Her words struck a chord, and Linda felt her eyes welling with emotion. To hear that she was accepted, that her community recognized her efforts, meant everything to her. In that moment, she felt the burden of her past actions lift, replaced by a sense of peace and fulfillment. She had worked hard to earn back the trust she had once taken for granted, and now, standing there with Dr. Jameson and Sarah, she felt that her redemption was real. As Dr. Jameson bid his goodbyes and left the diner, Linda stood at the door, watching him disappear down the street. Her heart was full, knowing she had come full circle, from a place of judgment and rigidity to one of forgiveness and acceptance. She turned back to the diner, where patrons were smiling at her, some nodding in silent approval. It was as though a quiet understanding had settled over the room, a shared recognition of the power of change and the beauty of redemption. From that day forward, Linda continued her work at the diner and the community center, her life now shaped by empathy and connection. She was no longer just the waitress who controlled the rules. She had become someone who truly cared for those she served, treating each person with the kindness and understanding she had once struggled to show. Her journey had come full circle, and in that completion, she found a new beginning. In the end, Linda's story became a small legend in the town, a reminder that no one is beyond redemption, and that change, while difficult, is always possible. Her community had accepted her back, not because she was perfect, but because she had shown the courage to confront her flaws and grow from them. And for Linda, that acceptance was the most rewarding gift of all, a quiet affirmation that she was, indeed, worthy of forgiveness and a second chance. If this story moved you, click here to watch another inspiring tale of transformation and redemption. Join us as we uncover more powerful moments that remind us of the strength in kindness and the beauty of second chances.